Division 296. Division 296, Andrew, is when the government imposes a tax, an additional tax on us, the population, the people of Australia, if you have a superannuation balance of greater than $3 million and you make a gain.
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host
Andrew. Bills, here we are back again.
And Andrew,
morning studio.
That's it. We say this week in, week out. Favorite time of the week, bringing a whole heap of value to our listeners and our viewers and talking about something that's been making headlines recently. So looking forward to doing a deeper dive into what this is and also using this as an opportunity to beat up on the government as well too, which is kind of becoming one of my favorite pastimes.
Yep, beating up on the government, beating up on the ATO, nothing better. But hey, you know what? That's what they get for putting more and more tax on people.
So speaking of tax, Andrew, we're talking to everybody about Division 296. Division 296, Andrew, is when the government imposes a tax, an additional tax on us, the population, the people of Australia, if you have a superannuation balance of greater than $3 million and you make a gain. They're going to tax you on the unrealized gain. And we'll do a deeper dive on what that is. But just as that comes out of my mouth, I can't believe I'm saying that, because that is absolutely ludicrous that these boffins will go and do something like this. In all of their wisdom, I've got no idea who's making these decisions, how they came up with these decisions, and how they actually think it'll work. Rocks in their head. Andrew, let's get cracking into it. I'm going to enjoy this one.
I think we're all going to enjoy this one. Look, additional 15% tax on anyone who has a superannuation balance above $3 million is essentially what that tax is. Now, it will be based off your superannuation balance on the 30th of June, 2025, or that is what we're expecting. Now, none of this has come into legislation yet, so this is still an expectation and not something that we know for absolute certainty, despite the fact that it is extremely likely and looking like it's almost a certainty.
I think it's a foregone conclusion, right?
Yeah, exactly. But essentially what that means is that if your balance is above $3 million in superannuation, now this is individual balance, right? So think your regular industry, retail, super fund, whatever it is. If you've got an individual balance above $3 million on the 30th of June, we're going to assume that it has come into legislation. This will impact you. If your balance is under that, it doesn't impact you until your balance is above $3 million on the 30th of June. Self-managed super fund, where you might have two parties in there, then the balance is it's still calculated on the individual balance. Mm-hmm. So individual balance of $3 million. So what you, particularly with people that, which you'd assume that they would if they've got that amount of money in super, are receiving advice, what a lot of people are doing, if they can, is potentially drawing money out of superannuation so that they hit just under that 30th or just under that $3 million balance on the 30th of June. And then whatever happens throughout the year is fine. That can still continue to increase or just get reassessed the next financial year as to whether you fall into that bracket or not.
Right. Let's go through some examples of how this works. And we understand that it's on an individual's balance. So if you're looking at it as a family unit and there's two members of the family essentially, or if it's an SMS, there's more SMSF, there's more people. But let's just assume that there's two people, it's $3 million each. Okay, so it's 6, but let's just focus on one person for the sake of the exercise, and it's 3 mil. So you start, say it's 30 June, which it will be soon. Well, actually, when this episode airs, it's probably going to be past, actually. 30 June, you've got $3 million on the knocker.
Yep.
So we fast forward 12 months' time. and your balance has increased. Let's assume you haven't taken any money out. So it's increased through income received plus capital growth of the underlying assets. Let's assume that it's increased by 10%, just because the numbers are easy. Yeah. So 30 June 2026, the assessment gets done and goes, your balance has increased by $300,000.
Yep.
What the government will do is apply an additional 15% tax on that 300 grand.
Yep. And that will be an effective tax rate of 30%.
Whether or not you've done anything or not.
Yep.
So not you've done anything. Let's assume that you haven't sold any of those assets. It's an unrealized paper gain.
Yep. So I think property is probably the perfect example.
We're going to pivot into property in a sec because it's a less liquid asset. But just under that one, you're being taxed on something where you haven't released the profit. Let's just pivot into property, actually, because that's probably going to be a really easy one to
explain. Yeah.
Let's say you've got a factory worth 3 mil.
Yep. Which is not uncommon.
Yep. Or a farm.
Yep. Yep. We're seeing a lot of farmers jumping up and down as a result of this legislation.
And the farmland goes up by 10%, so it's worth 3.3 mil. So the government comes along and says, we want not only our 15% tax, but we want the additional 15.
Well, I think the difference is that it's not just that there's an additional 15% tax. It's that last year, if my farm went from $3 million to $3.3 million, I wouldn't be paying anything because until I've sold that asset, I haven't made a capital gain.
Exactly.
Because I don't have any of that money. So how can I be expected to pay you a tax when I don't actually have the money? In the new legislation, so in Division 296, it's now a scenario, and I can't even actually believe that I'm saying this.
You can't say it with a straight face.
Yeah. It's now a scenario where, okay, now you're paying an additional 15% tax on top of it, and you're saying, okay, the tax rate's going to go from 15% to 30%. I could maybe understand that, perhaps. But we're now talking about the fact that, okay, you're not just going to pay an additional tax as a result of it. You're going to pay tax on something that you haven't actually made the money. You haven't sold the asset. You haven't actually got any of the money. You know, on that same scenario, let's just say that that property has gone up 10% and it's now worth $330,000. Where do you find $90,000? I mean, the ATO comes along and says, I need $90,000. Where do I physically find that money in order to be able to pay the tax?
Look, if it's a liquid asset, shares, ETFs, managed funds, bonds, you name it, you could carve off a bit. But if it's a factory or if it's farmland's probably a little bit different because you could snap some of it off. But essentially what this is doing is this is forcing people
To sell the asset.
to sell the asset. This is not just an opportunity to get more money from the government. This is a blatant play that they want people to sell and discharge assets.
And look, we can talk about, you know, the implications of it and the impact that it has to an individual person when they're caught up in this legislation. And we'll talk a little bit about, you know, at the moment, the government is talking about the fact that this impacts such a small minority of the population. Okay, now that may be true right now, but there's no indexation on this $3 million. There's no indication that that will ever occur.
They've actually come out and said that they're not going to index it.
Correct.
Yep.
Now, if you look, and it was, I cannot remember who did the numbers, and I'd love to be able to source it, but they looked at a 22-year-old earning average income, generating an average rate of return. They will reach that $3 million balance, assuming that they continue working until they finish working at the age of 65. They will reach that $3 million balance. So this will encapture a large portion of the population. And I think that that's ultimately what the government is relying on. But the even bigger issue that I have with this, and, you know, aside from the people that are physically impacted by it, as an advisor, you talk to clients and you're discussing, strategies and heading towards a particular direction to take someone's finances based off where the legislation currently is at. So for someone to have accumulated $3 million in their superannuation, they've probably done a number of things in order to be able to get that asset into that environment and take advantage of a lower tax environment.
Yep.
Now, when you go and change the legislation and you say, hey, not only are we changing the legislation right now and you have basically no time to pivot and adjust, but we're also not going to grandfather any people that already have a balance above and beyond this number. We're not making any allowances. You lose confidence in the system.
Yep.
And the whole purpose of what we're trying to do is tell people, hey, put money into superannuation. It's a really great asset from a compound interest perspective. It's a lower tax environment. Yes, you can't access it until you reach retirement, but hey, you're not going to be reliant on, age pension. You're going to be less reliant on the government. And all of a sudden now you're saying, we've just realized that there's some money that we can grab in there. Let's just dip our hand into that little honeypot. And once you dip that hand into the honeypot once, what's to say that you're not going to do it again? And so now it's $3 million. What happens if in X amount of time it becomes $2 million? Then it becomes 1.5. Now, I'm not saying that that's what is going to happen, but that's the things that you're going to be battling with, in that you don't want people to be reliant on age pension. You want people to be self-sufficient in their retirement. And then on the flip side, you're saying, but I might change the rules and I may reverse it on you. So
yeah, well, this is what you've described is the government gaming the system. So if you think about this, the rules of preservation exist because the investment works best when it is compounded and it's not mucked around with, right? You've got your super guarantee contribution. So your employer is mandated to put in, as at the start of the financial year, 12% of your earnings into superannuation. And then you can't touch it for a certain period of time as well too. There's certain limits and thresholds into how much money you can put in. There's certain limits and thresholds on the minimum amount that you can pull out when you're eligible to take money out. And then all of a sudden, there's this thing that they've just gone and put in. So it's like, hang on, we're forcing you to save in this system. And you mentioned the 22-year-old and those calculations with the expectation that we're going to get a really big chunk of change as a government at the end of the day on unrealized gains. This is absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. Come out and say, hey, we don't want people to have excess superannuation because it's in a concessional environment, and we feel like people are using that as an opportunity to be able to pass on wealth effectively, or to not pay their fair share of taxes. Different story. Okay, I understand that could be the rhetoric, but coming out and then levying this against an unrealized gain, and I'll use another example that hits closer to home, is absolutely ridiculous. Imagine if this was on, let's say, the property market. So your owner-occupier, and the government turn around. It's exactly like saying, okay, if your house grows in value above a certain threshold, because it is above the $3 million, we're not talking below. So it's the growth that you'd experience above 3 mil. But imagine it was your family home, just to put it into context about how ridiculous this concept is. Your family home is worth 3 mil today. It grows by 10% over a year. It's now worth 3.3. The government turn around and say, hey, we need $90,000 to pay for the tax associated with that. Where do you get the money from in order to do that? And why has that triggered some sort of capital gain or taxable event when you haven't transacted? Because the whole tax system works on the actual gain that has been made.
Yeah.
But in this instance, the asset hasn't been sold or discharged. They'll get their pound of flesh eventually when that happens. It's just beyond comprehension. And this sort of dumb crap that we're seeing, I actually thought it was limited to places like America with all of the crap that's going on in their political system. It seems that we've been infected by it here as well too. And the Treasurer, above and beyond that, is now starting to talk about increasing GST too. That's a completely different topic. Maybe that's the next podcast.
But you look at it and you say, okay, well, if you're taxing an unrealized gain, and this is the type of this is the type of thinking that is going to impact people, and it's going to impact the decisions that people make. Because you can sit there and say, yep, this is going to impact a small minority of the population. It's only the rich, it's only them, they're only the ones that are going to be impacted by it. But you use that example of your family home. And what happens if the next thing that they look at is, if your family home is worth over a certain value, well, you're just storing assets in an asset that's paying zero tax, And so if you can tax an unrealized capital gain in super, why can't you tax an unrealized gain outside of superannuation?
Look, who knows how far and wide this goes?
And so that's the type of confidence that you start losing in the system. And when you start losing confidence in the system, it's not just the impact that it has to those individual people and the decisions that people make, but it's also, you're talking about a global economy where you're attracting overseas investors, you're attracting overseas wealth in order to have a functioning economy. And all of a sudden people are saying, you know what? I can't trust this. I can't trust that I am coming into a particular landscape and playing by certain rules, and then you're going and changing those rules thereafter, and not making tweaks around the edges around, the percentage that you're paying in income tax and where that bracket lies and all of that stuff. No, you're completely changing the entire system. It is absolutely crazy.
Andrew, I reckon we should have been a politician. Or politicians.
We should have.
Yeah, look, I don't know where this goes. It's, like I said, it's a foregone conclusion because the government has got power, the Greens are backing it. Actually, the Greens were talking about a $2 million limit rather than $3 million. So this will get through. The thing that I'm concerned about is that, because over time we're going to change governments. Will successive governments look at this in its lunacy and go, this doesn't make any sense, we're going to roll it back? Or are they going to say, yeah, let's blame the other guys, but we're going to benefit off that with the revenue? It raises a much larger issue that the government, take America as an example, but we're not much better here, but our government have lost fiscal responsibility, and the only lever that they can pull in order to try and claw some of this stuff back is to keep taxing its citizens. And they're finding more and more craftier ways that make absolutely no sense. Where's the incentive? Where's the incentive to try? Where's the incentive to grow your assets? The whole idea behind superannuation is so people aren't relying on the age pension or the government social security net to be able to support them in retirement and old age.
The thing that I don't, and I can tell you exactly what's going to happen, but the thing that I don't understand with it is, okay, say that happens. Let's use that scenario. $3 million property becomes $3.3 million from the valuation perspective. You pay the government your $990,000 in tax. What happens next year if that property goes from $3.3 million back to $3 million? Are you going to give me my $90,000 back? I can guarantee you that that's not going to happen. But if you can tax an unrealized gain, then you should be giving me a deduction on unrealized losses then.
I must admit, I don't know what's the case in that instance because everybody's just been looking at the game. But look,
I can just guarantee that they will not pay that.
Okay, but let's go a little bit further in our thinking. What does that then look like over 3, 4, 5, 6 years where you've got this balance that goes up, down, what have you? What an administrative nightmare.
Yeah.
Oh, Andrew, I feel like I'm going to throw the microphone at the computer. With this one, this is the dumbest thing that I've seen that's come out of the government's mouth in a long period of time.
Yeah, and that's a pretty high bar.
Yeah,
like to top some stuff that's happened in the past. That's a pretty high bar. But look, let's maybe try to bring it on track. What do you do? How do you actually navigate this? And I'm asking this not as a question that's going to really generate an answer, but what are some practical things that our viewers and our listeners can ultimately consider?
Getting advice. So you need to, if you're worried about starting to hit that threshold or that territory, you need to get advice, and you need to do it early because it does take time to shift things potentially around. We're quite fortunate. I was using the example before, if you're talking about 2 members of a household, it can be $3 million each. So you are talking about a very hefty amount of money, relatively speaking, but it does take time to be able to plan that out. And if that's the case, you almost, just using, say, a traditional superannuation fund where you've got, two members, maybe two members of a couple, and one earns more than the other. And then over time, what we generally tend to see is that one person's balance grows faster than the other because they're getting more money put into it. Need to be a little bit more strategic around how do we then balance that out so we can both approach the $3 million mark evenly, which will then prevent the, this 296 lunacy from happening. But ultimately, I think it's a matter of getting advice and being a lot more strategic in your thinking if you're heading towards this territory. It plays into our hand as advisors simply because people need more help and more assistance with it. So even though I rant and rave about it, it does create genuine opportunity, but it's not good for people and it's not good for the country.
No, and I think that even considering, you're now at a point where when something like this is coming in, you have to consider that, okay, perhaps there's a $3 million limit at the moment, but the Greens are already talking about having that at a $2 million limit. So you have to factor in the risk when you're considering your strategy development and whether you're considering, going down one particular route or the other. You also need to factor in the risk that, hey, this might not be at 3 mil, it might be lower, and it may get pushed down. So that needs to factor into some of the decisions that you're ultimately making.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. But look, if any of our viewers and our listeners are in that position, or you want more information about that, or you want to have a chat and vent, I'd love to talk to you. Andrew, thank you for today.
Thanks, Bills. Appreciate it. Thanks to all of our listeners and our viewers. And if you got some value out of that one, like, subscribe, share it, lobby to your local government, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au. The information in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into account your personal objectives, financial situation, or needs. It is not financial, legal, or tax advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should consider whether the information is appropriate to your circumstances and seek professional advice before acting on any of the information provided. Past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of Acumen Financial Planning Proprietary Limited.